So for those who don't know me, my name is Lucy Finlay. I am the event director for Elevate. Obviously, given the current situation and the kind of the events industry over the last few months, there is no live event for 2020. So we'll be coming together at London's Excel next year for the 5th edition of Elevate. And Youth Sport Trust have been a supporter of the event since it launched back in 2016. So this session has been put together by Youth Sport Trust and looks at sport, young people and COVID-19. And I will pass you over now to Will, CEO of Youth Sport Trust, to introduce the rest of the panellists and the session. Thank you, Will.
Thanks, Lucy, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure for myself personally and also for the Youth Sport Trust to have this opportunity to share with you a little about what we and our friends at SOAS have learned and observed in how young people have responded to COVID over the last few months. Be prepared, please, to forgive us for when we make slight mistakes in our presentations today due to the format. I think we're all used to that as well. But we're really looking forward to sharing. And the format we're going to follow is pretty straightforward. I'll shortly introduce the two panellists who will both make presentations for around 15 minutes each, and we'll then enter a discussion. If you do have questions, please do throw them into the chat, and then we'll find a way of working those through. Unless I have a personal turmoil about reading the chat and lose confidence in my own IT skills, which is quite possible. And I then at that point go, oh, I haven't been able to then move the slide forward. There we go. So our panellists today are two good friends of mine. First, we've got Simon Rofe, Dr. Simon Rofe from SOAS, who is an international expert in sport policy and diplomacy. And we're going to start the presentations today with Simon's insight into what he's observed with colleagues in the industry. And then it's my absolute pleasure to introduce my colleague Amanda Vernalls from Youth Sport Trust, who's our Head of Research and Insight. And on a almost, I want to say weekly basis, Amanda, but it's probably felt more like daily to you, Amanda's been updating an internal insight paper for us, drawing on research from across the industry, as well as our own unique and original research that we've conducted with schools and with young people in this time. And Amanda's going to share with you all some of the findings from that. But I guess for some of our audience today, there is that question of, well, who are the Youth Sport Trust? So we're a charity. We're currently celebrating our 25th anniversary. Not quite in the style we had planned at the start of the year. It's been a rather different year for us to celebrate. But we're a charity that fundamentally believes that sport's got something unique and powerful to offer to young people in improving their lives. Our commitment is not to raising future champions in sport, but our commitment is absolutely to using the power of sport to build confidence, competence, leadership skills, communication skills in young people to help them lead happy, fulfilled lives where they feel a real sense of belonging with each other. And our mission and vision are on the screen for you to see right now. So we've been around for 25 years, and over that period of time, just to place ourselves in a little bit of context, we set about the creation of a national school sport infrastructure, about 20 years ago, I think. And through that, we actually managed to map and include every single school in England into that infrastructure, millions of young people, and delivered significant amounts of school sport, working with a locally based team of people out on the ground. We worked hard to try and influence government, and we still do. And we helped to create this target of providing 2 hours physical education per week, which was measured in every school. And rose by around 30% over a 4-year period that it was measured through the support that we were able to give to schools. And since 2011, we've led the school games, which is a DCMS-owned scheme to get more young people involved in physical activity and sport. Over 10,000 schools in England complete the school games mark, which is the stamp of approval, if you like, for getting more and more young people involved in that scheme and more active. And over 21,000 schools in England take part in the school games each year, which out of a grand total of around 24,000, when you include all alternative provisions, is a real significant chunk of our school population. Is something that we thoroughly enjoy doing. As part of our role working in youth sport, we get to meet all kinds of really, really interesting third parties. And I was really fortunate to spend time with Dr Simon Rofe and a number of other colleagues from the world of sport diplomacy coming up to a year ago, talking about all kinds of issues around the integrity of sport. And through that, Simon and I kept in good contact with each other, and I began to really start to plug Simon to learn more about what, from a societal level, was being observed on the impact of sport on young people. And so it's my real great pleasure to introduce Simon to you now, to give his insights into what we've observed through Covid-19. Simon, I'm going to shift onto remote control so you can hopefully control the slides, and if it doesn't work, I've made the excuses and it'll be obvious to everyone that it's my fault. So let's see what happens.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Will, thank you for that kind invitation, and thank you to everyone for joining us this afternoon. Hopefully this is going to click forward to my slides. No,
a moment, and then if it doesn't,
we'll give up. Okay, well, in such an inauspicious start, let me move on. I want to talk to you about young people's sport and COVID from my perspective, and I come at this on a number of levels, and I will attempt to work my way through and demonstrate them to you over the course of the next 10 minutes or so. Oh, and see, I've managed to make my first mistake by going too far forward in my slides. So let me go back a couple. Now they're all going forward. Will, would you be kind enough to go back to the beginning?
I will indeed. Is that where you want to be?
Yeah, so let's start with this. So those of you with long enough memories will recall that it was 8 years ago yesterday that the London 2012 Olympics began. And one of the features that many of us will have enjoyed was that opening ceremony that Danny Boyle put together, referencing many features of British society, including the NHS, which has been very much to the fore in our current climate. I think the emphasis that, or the point I want to make very clearly by showing this image to start with, is the connection between sport and society. And society is made up of many, many different stakeholder groups, as we would recognise, including, importantly, a large number of people who don't necessarily get to vote and whose voices have not necessarily always been heard. The young people, you know, we were all young once, and our level of enfranchisement in many of these processes was perhaps limited. There is certainly capacity for us as slightly older people now to emphasize this, and this is why, you know, many of my conversations with Will over the last year have been so fruitful, is to consider this group of people often has very, you know, fuzzy edges, usefully, because age is just a number, and we shouldn't be you know, necessarily defined by what the voting age is as what young people are constituted by. So let's think here about how young people as a constituency, as stakeholders, and the groups that represent them, such as the Youth Sport Trust, are able to engage with here. So, Will, if you'd be so kind. I come at this from the position of sport diplomacy, and I won't dwell on this for now. Suffice to say that what we try to do in understanding sport and diplomacy is recognise that the characteristics, the practice of diplomacy in representation, negotiation and communication are things that we find in many walks of life, and the confluence of those features in the world of sport writ large, be that at the international level of federations and bodies like the IOC, or indeed at the very the grassroots level, is something that sport diplomacy seeks to explain and recognises the different realms in which sport and society interact. This network of evolving networks, as I've described it. Will, is it kind? Thank you. And this background is something that, you know, came to me, or, you know, was very much to the fore in my thinking around how we dealt with COVID-19 early on in the pandemic. So one of the striking features which, you know, was part of our societal responses on a global level was the involvement of sport and physical activity in dealing with COVID-19. And I say dealing with it, not because it is dealt with by any stretch of the imagination. We can see in our daily lives how it's still very much impacting on whether we were planning on going to Spain for our holidays in the rest of August or elsewhere. But what it is telling us, and this is not a UK story by any stretch only, is that sport and physical activity have a number of important correlations to the health and well-being of individuals and society. It's clear that there are correlations and indeed causations between levels of obesity, levels of exercise that have contributed to people's ability to address and overcome COVID. There is correlation and indeed causation between people's physical activity and their ability to fight the virus, and indeed to avoid hospitalization, and within hospitalization to avoid being part of a ICU, intensive care unit. So there is clearly something here which has a medical and scientific dimension. I am by no means a medical doctor, so I'm not going to dwell on that. But I think we can say that there is this relationship exists. And what I posited, and I'd be very welcome to have people's thoughts on this further, is that there is an emphasis, or was certainly in the early part of COVID, looking at individual sports, solo sports, and sports such as walking, cycling, running, things that one did on one's own. And this was practical and indeed mandatory, given the situation we face. We had to be within our own family bubbles, to use a word of the day, and to limit our contact with others. So sport became a solo enterprise. We were allowed, and whatever the merits of the individual policies, whether you were in France or Spain or the UK or elsewhere in the world, limited amounts of activities you could do outside your household. One of them was sport. It became one of a very limited number of things you could leave your home for. But again, in that sort of individual environment, even within neighbours or small environments, these were not permitted on the whole. So the idea of sport as being an individual enterprise was very much to the fore. And this juxtaposed and creates a tension with many of the things we know about sport as a social vector. We know that sport provides points of common experience. We know that sport provides opportunities to talk and share experiences, not necessarily just the physical exertion of playing on a team, but in the shared experience of being part of a class, or being part of a PE session at a school, or a team kind of environment. And so I think there's this solo social spectrum of sport that COVID has put into different relief. It's put it into stark relief in many regards, and as we've seen, as we've rolled back strict measures of lockdown, different degrees of social interaction and social engagement with the physical activity in sport that we're seeing. So one can now participate in small group team activities within different sports. And this slowly but surely has, I think, reconfigured in very interesting ways, in ways that we haven't necessarily fully thought about, the ways that sport will be manifest moving forward. And in this sense, and the point I made in this article about the solo social spectrum of sport was about the forces of realignment. What are the things that are going to realign our understanding of sport as we move, I'm loath to say into a post-COVID world, because I'm not a crystal ball purveyor, but increasingly learn to address and deal with the consequences and circumstances of COVID-19. But this tension, I think, is still going to exist. Can we have the same social experience of sport? Can we look to sport to provide that in a world where you can't bring yourselves together in this way? And I think that is one of the questions, particularly for young people, because it asks them to do things individually that they haven't been either used to, or that society isn't built for them to do, moving forward. So individual sports are very valid, whether you're playing tennis or golf or what have you, but they haven't necessarily been as prominent in school syllabi, in the way that local societies are configured to provide sport to young people. And that requires quite a lot of conscious change on behalf of the governance structures, those individual governing bodies and others who are joining into the as stakeholders into this equation, but also challenges those individuals. And some children may not have given much thought to this in the past, but actually does this lead to an opportunity here to diversify away from our mainstream sports, which many of us know and love, football and cricket and what have you, to think about other sports and other opportunities for physical activity, which wouldn't necessarily have been able to compete, to use that terminology, with the big sports. And again, that's not to suggest that's good or bad, but it is opportunity. And I think that's something that we should certainly consider. I think the other things to recognise here and to draw out, possibly in relation to bigger concepts that we won't dwell on, also around the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, the Kazan Action Plan that UNESCO has in place, and some of those rather grandiose and meta level considerations. But to drill down and think about sport as a tool for social transformation, for education, and thinking about some of those opportunities that we have now that again may have been crowded out by previous conceptions of sport. And as we realign, how can we engage with that to a greater degree? Will, would you be kind enough to shift along? So here I just highlight a couple of points. One is around the opportunity for social transformation. One of the more remarkable things that has happened amongst many in the first 6 months of the year was the engagement of the Manchester United footballer Marcus Rashford with food poverty campaign, the details of which I'm sure many of you will be familiar. But I think what I'm reading here is the opportunity for an individual story, one that a young person of colour brought out in a relatively deprived area of Greater Manchester, one that has particular individual circumstances, that he was able to tell that story. His footballing career has given him a platform to make that point, but that he was able to use that in a way that not just benefited the people who be recipients of school meals through the course of the summer holidays that we're now in, but also one that gave a platform to other points of social justice. And I think here the intersection with the Black Lives Matter campaign, which as a young person of colour he was clearly engaged with also by virtue of the league and the profession he was in. He was, in some senses you might say, obliged to be part of it, but I think by all accounts as an individual he was engaged with it. Certainly his social media presence indicated that. And I think therefore, and without overlooking the fact that this is also excludes other groups that we need to recognise, that there is an equality and inclusion, diversity dimension here that sport can provide in a way that wouldn't have happened, if we'd have played out the European Championships, for example, in the summer of 2020, I don't think, at least. And I think the opportunity to engage young people on that front and to look at the role model that sportsmen provide. Now, that is a double-edged sword, as we would all recognise. Some sportsmen and women have not necessarily taken up that role, and that's up to them, of course. But there is an opportunity here, and I think some of this role modelling is something that we could certainly pay greater attention to. I'd also point to some of the broader impacts here, and this isn't just within the education environment or for younger people, but in changing some of the structural forces at work. Will, if you'd be so kind. So just share this slide, largely to follow up on the Black Lives Matter point, but also to share that it's the broadcaster BT Sport are making this pledge on inclusion and diversity. Now, well, many corporations have taken, up the cause in the last couple of months since the death of George Floyd. And of course, Floyd's not alone. We should recognise that. But I think this illustrates some of the broader societal impacts that shape young people's lives as they continue to grow up. Whether they're, the degree to which they care about BT Sport as a corporation, as an element of BT, is possibly mute. But the fact that you're changing some of the structures here will hopefully provide other opportunities further down the line for people of colour, and particularly, the young people coming through. So I think this is what, an opportunity that we shouldn't overlook. And again, Will, if I'd be so kind, this isn't just football. Having said that there was opportunity for other sports, I, consciously looked at football in Rashford's case. But I think the opportunity, and particularly within the world of cricket, to take up the Black Lives Matter piece, and I'm sure many of you will have seen the film that Sky Sports put together, that they showed at the beginning of the Test series with the visiting West Indies who've been here, and I would suggest that that's a very powerful piece of filmmaking in the current context, and one that I'm sure I'm not alone in having watched it with my young children themselves. Actually were able to make some very important points about racism, anti-racism, and dealing with this in a society, in this country, in a contemporary fashion. But I think the point that I take from this, and this will be my sort of final slide, if you'd be so kind, Will, is really about the importance of education here, utilising this moment of COVID to educate young people about the society in which they live, and the opportunities, the risks and the threats that it poses, but also the opportunities that they have to get that meaningful change. And on that, I'll be quiet. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Simon. Now, before I hand over to Amanda, I have one question for Amanda. Do you want me to do your slides?
I could try to do my slides and see how we go. Shall I risk it?
Let's go for it. Let me...
Okay.
You're in.
Is it working?
Let's see. Hang on. Let's get Simon off the control.
It says I can control your screen, Will.
You fire away, Amanda.
I have power. We'll see how we go. I'll start with this, and at the moment I'm on the right slide, so we'll see how we go. So hopefully I can pick up on some of the points that Simon's brought to the attention there, and I think there's quite a few of the things that Simon said. I've got some stats to back up as I go through this. So as Will said, this is the product of 2 or 3 months worth of pulling together evidence from across a variety of different sources, from academic sources, government data, newspaper articles. There's a lot of stuff out there, and also some of the work that we've been doing within Youth Sport Trust to really understand what are the key issues that are emerging as a result of COVID, and particularly the restrictions that COVID's placed on children. So I'll start by giving a bit of context, because I think it's important to just reflect on exactly what children have lost or have had happen to them in the last few months. So for a start, the closure of schools, but that's not just about the education. There's so much more that schools will bring to a child. So there's the loss of the associated support services and the other things that are associated with going to school. So about safeguarding, the mental health and the wellbeing support, free school meals, which Simon mentioned, the special educational needs support, physical activity. Now that is both direct, sort of timetabled PE, but also indirect, going to school, wandering around in school, playing at lunchtime, all that sort of tangential physical activity that you don't tend to think about, but all adds up during the day. And then they're also missing out on the social interaction. So the play times, but also in lessons. And we know that when people are now doing home education, it's that social interaction with their friends and with the teacher that makes it more difficult to learn. And one of the big things is about just missing out on the milestones. So, you know, some children have been through an awful lot. You know, if I think about my son, you know, in the space of 7 minutes listening to Boris, he didn't do his A-levels, he didn't go on a trip with his mates around the world, you know, he didn't get to finish school. You know, everything stopped really abruptly. There's some big rites of passage that just didn't happen for children, and that's obviously can be pretty traumatic. I can't move the slides, so I think over to you, Will. I tried.
Bear with me. Yeah.
So thinking about what else children have missed or have experienced. So I mentioned the introduction of home learning, which has been patchy. So for some people it's been great. For others, it's either a lack of equipment or it's the provision through school has been more difficult, and home learning has impacted particularly on the inequalities in society. I think those gaps have really been opened up, and we can see work from the EF, for instance, about how those educational gaps are really opening up now for children. Children have also been forced to stay at home. And as Simon said, you know, they're interactive beings, and we know that children feel the impact of not interacting with other people more acutely than adults. So they feel social distance more, they feel stress more acutely because their brains are at that age where they actually need, they're more acutely aware of stress. It impacts them more effectively. And they're also 3 times more likely to develop depression as a result of being lonely. So that not only have they had more impacts, I would say, but they've actually, they feel those impacts more strongly. And on top of all of that, there's also a risk of catching COVID, which is, you know, a deadly disease. Either they're going to catch it or that their parents could catch it, or some of their loved ones. So that's an awful lot for people to take on. So what impact has that had? If you could do the next slide, please, Will. So yeah, not surprisingly, we've seen an increase in mental health issues. So this is some Bernardo's work, which shows children are lonelier, sadder, more worried, more stressed. And some work coming out of the University of Sheffield shows that children are starting to show traumatic symptoms, so difficulty in sleeping and PTSD kind of symptoms in some children. I think we have to be careful here. You know, this affects some children more than others. But well, if you can do another slide, sorry, I've got builds on these, it's going to be a pain for you. We know that some groups are disproportionately affected, and I think it's here where we're going to have to start thinking about interventions in particular for these groups. So those with pre-existing mental conditions haven't been able to access the appropriate support that they probably had before. We also know that children from a BAME background, children with special educational needs, and people in receipt of pupil premium have been more adversely affected, and also children of key workers who may have had different levels of disruption. They may have seen their parents having to go out to work, they may have had to go into an empty school, they may see much more starkly the impacts of COVID than others. If I can do the next slide, please, Will. Thanks. So what's that mean in terms of mental health? And I think it's important that this is anxiety and trauma, and that's sort of, you know, in people's lives, everyone has anxiety and trauma. It's how that actually affects you in the long term. So it doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to have a negative effect from this. So for some, Levita said recently, if you give people structures, you can come through this in a stronger way. And if we provide the right support, we've got potential here to inspire people and to build greater resilience. However, there's a feeling that there's around 4 million children who are going to need some targeted help and support. And Young Minds have been calling for various levels of support, such as transition periods back into school, increased NHS support, and a whole range of measures to help those children. And I think schools are going to have a role to play in helping children return to that new normal. And of course, within Youth Sport Trust, you know, we have a role to play in thinking about the role of PE and physical activity and how that can help with mental health problems. Do the next slide, please, Will. There's loads of builds on this. I'm sorry, build it up, that's fine. So what do we know about physical activity? Well, the good news is 93% are doing something to stay active. That's the good news. 7% are not. but the amount of activity has fallen, and it's continuing to fall. Now, this is work from Sport England. It's a report they brought out a couple of weeks ago. So pre-COVID levels of people meeting the 60 minutes a day target for the CMO was 47%. It wasn't great, but it had been slowly creeping up. That's gone down to 19%, and the latest Comres data that they released last week says it's falling even more. So despite things easing, it's now down to about 13%. And the inequality gaps that we saw beforehand are remaining. So it's the less affluent, it's people from a BAME background, it's secondary school age children. They're all much more likely to be doing no activity. If we could do the next slide, Will, sorry. So what's affecting the lower levels? Hopefully a lot of this can sort of, once we get back to normal, in inverted commas, some of this can be reversed. So what's happening at the moment is there's a lack of access to facilities, so organised facilities like gyms and classes and centres, and the more informal settings like playgrounds. Obviously no access to those until very recently, so that's obviously been affecting people not being able to get out and get active. School closures had a big effect, as I mentioned before. It's not just the timetable stuff, but it's access to equipment, for instance. Not everyone's got access to footballs and all the other associated things that you need. And it's also the associated opportunities that come with school. So it's the after school club, it's the provision of the on-site facilities. And finally, there's been concern about should I let my child out if you're a parent, because they're concerned about the virus. And children are also concerned about leaving the house, you know, who'd blame them, you know. If I could have the next slide, please. So the interesting thing is, and Simon mentioned this, I think there are some opportunities, and the Sport England data, again, which I've got here, does start to show some green shoots. So we've seen that girls more than boys and BAME children more than white children are more likely to say that they've increased activity during lockdown, and they're also more likely to say that they've enjoyed it. Now, traditionally, these don't. So I think there's something interesting here that Simon touched on. Is it there's different types of activity? Is it that it's not team sport? It's different types of sport. It's less competitive, potentially. It's less judgmental. So we know from our Girls Active work that a lot of girls don't want to get sweaty in front of other people. They don't want to not look their best. Maybe in this more informal kind of atmosphere where you haven't got this team structure, some people feel more able to get active. And I think that's a real nugget that's worth sort of taking forward and thinking about. The other green shoot really is that children are more likely to say they're exercising for the benefit it brings rather than negative results. Now I know 69 and 52 add up to more than 100, so there's some people who are doing both, but there's quite a bit in there about parents saying that they wanted their children to do more exercise and sort of dragging them along. And I think that's an interesting point in its own right, that you've got parents who are now seeing the effect and the impact of exercise and a benefit from it. And our own research has shown that, you know, more than a third of children now say they see sport and exercise as more important to their lives than they did before. 27% say it made them feel better, and over half say they plan to do more in the future than they did in the past. I'll have the next slide, please. Another interesting thing that's come out of the Sport England data is the role of parents as role models and as advocates. So children have had to go exercising with their parents much more. And it's interesting to see that the more active a parent is, the more active their children are. And the more a parent enjoys exercise, the more likely their children are too. And I think as both have seen benefits during lockdown, there's an interesting thing in here about, is there a role for children and families maybe to do more together? And also, will they see, will parents be much more advocates for the role of PE and sport, etc., having seen what those benefits are? And as Simon said, the government's prioritised it. It was one of the only things that you could do during lockdown. I think it's set a seed in some people's heads that actually this is something that I ought to be doing that is good for me, and then people have seen the benefits. If you have the next slide, please. So just a few more slides to end. So if we think about returning to school, we've done research amongst children and parents and teachers, and children are worried. So 4 in 5 children at the moment are worried as they come out of lockdown and they go back to school. The main thing they're worried about is spending time with their friends, and they're also concerned about the virus and getting back into a school routine. And there's particular groups that we need to think about here. So you can see girls are particularly interested in whether they can spend time with their friends and the social element of getting back to school. If I could have the next slide as well, please. From a parent's point of view, It's interesting. So at the moment, parents are still very reluctant to send their children back to school. There's still huge safety concerns there. We know that there are highly variable levels of attendance when people went back in June. And the latest reports say that around a quarter are not intending to send their children back in September. I think that's based on what's there at the moment and what the latest advice is. And I think what we need to take from this is just that parents are worried and they're going to need some reassurance. But it's not just about the safety in terms of the virus safety. It's also, are they going to have the right provisions in place to support mental and emotional needs that may arise. So parents are looking for an emphasis on playtime and move away from this pressure to catch up straight away. Obviously, there are children that are going to need help with learning, but that needs to be weighed up. And parents aren't looking to have the first few weeks with people cramming information in, because we know from other research that we've done that wellbeing is rated as much more important than academic achievement when parents are looking to select schools. We just go to the next couple. I promise it won't be much longer. So when teachers are thinking about what they're expecting to see in September, I think we've got some interesting things coming through. So 3/4 are expecting that they're going to have difficulty adjusting back to routine. This is the children. But what I think is interesting is low levels of physical fitness. So more than half of teachers, having seen what they've seen already about the children who've come back, are now worried about levels of physical fitness being low, and are thinking about how they can potentially tackle that as children come back into school. We'd have the next one, please, Will. So we know there's some interesting signs from the government. So they are encouraging schools to prioritise physical activity, which is great. And they're calling out the links between physical activity in terms of improving physical fitness, but also the links to mental well-being and to educational attainment. And that's great news, I think, to actually call out that link. Having spoken to some school leaders, we did some research at Youth Sport Trust, and over half of school leaders say that their focus of PE is going to change as a result of COVID. So as well as increasing physical fitness, there's going to be a greater focus on using PE to get some of the well-being and outcomes out of it as well, and a level of enjoyment. And I think I'm there, my final slide. So I think the issue is going to be how you deliver PE in this new world. So as Simon said, at the moment, there's a focus really on much more sort of singular activities, and it's going to be a while until people feel safe and able to deliver what used to be team sport. So only around half of schools at the moment say come September they're expecting to deliver PE entitlement straight away, and the barriers are around social distancing and equipment and logistics. And the same, 3/4 of people are saying that the provision of after-school clubs isn't going to be there in the short term either. So that very much points towards potentially thinking about new ways to deliver PE in the short run. And schools are just looking for two things really. One is how to adapt within the government guidelines, so shared equipment, hygiene, etc. But then also more support into thinking about how we can address the wellbeing issues using PE. That's it.
Thank you very well. Thank you very much, Amanda. And I have to say, both you and Simon hit your timings spot on. So thank you both very much. Obviously, we've got the chat facility available if questions from our audience emerge. If I may, I'll start with a couple if I can. Simon, would you be able to oh, I can see questions coming in already. Brilliant. Simon's unmuted and I can see you as well. So I wanted to pick up, if I can, to start with, on the timing of the publication of our latest obesity plan or strategy over the weekend. And in the context, I guess, of what you both shared really around what COVID did for the way that sport and exercise was positioned in the minds of the population, but also what you've seen in the initial take on that emerging strategy. What's that telling us, I guess, about that? As you put it earlier, Simon, there's evidence of an opportunity, if you like, around change or a challenge. So what are we seeing in that obesity plan?
Well, it strikes me, and and it's possible to caricature the Prime Minister's individual position here, which I'll gloss over. But I think the recognition that it's in the nation's health that we, in dealing with COVID and potentially other similar health challenges, that we are simply a fitter and healthier nation, that we are eating less foods which are bad for us, that we are doing more exercise. And I say, I'm not a clinician in this respect, but it strikes me, and where I would be very clear about this is the communication dimension of this. Being clear that being healthy is your best way of countering COVID. And if you are unfortunate enough to succumb, as some of us have, it's actually your best way of not being severely compromised by the disease. Having a strong respiratory system, which comes about through forms of exercise, whether that's a daily walk, with a dog, or in some senses, or running a marathon. Both of these are ways of keeping yourself healthy and less likely to feel the full effects of COVID. And it strikes me that some of that messaging would have been there in the past. Having a healthy lifestyle is a way of countering any form of virus disease, but it is such a stark message at the moment that it is perhaps impacting people in ways that a politician standing behind a podium or a sportsman saying be like me and be healthy doesn't have the same effect. The demonstrable, and I'm sure many of the people on the call have been, know people who've been poorly and know people who've been into hospital potentially, and potentially people who have passed away. And these are not the only factor. Clearly, there are others of that phrase that we became very familiar, underlying conditions. But it is according to the science, an important factor here, and therefore, particularly amongst young people, and we know about the dangers of youth obesity, making sure that young people are active. And that doesn't mean in the way that it might have done in a fully organised league of under-10s football, but simply being out and about. We were blessed in the first couple of months of the COVID lockdown by some beautiful weather in many parts of the United Kingdom. And the opportunity to be outside is something that was a feature of many people's lockdowns, but that won't last forever. The great British weather doesn't afford us that luxury. So how do we take advantage of the facilities we do have? Can we create sort of effectively domestic gym kind of environments? One doesn't need to have huge amounts of kit. A tin of tomato soup will work just as well as a dumbbell for many of these things. So I think there's some imaginative use, and I think engaging with young people in how can you achieve your raising your heart rate, being part of a community exercise, is something that many people took advantage of. I think there's something there about building out that community and utilizing the affordances of online devices. We're familiar with the Joe Wicks effect, which was as much the sort of psychological and community one as it was perhaps the physical one. But the impact of that, I think shouldn't be underestimated. Because it was able to, the affordances of the technology took that particular individual and his, physical education regime and questions about his, status as a PE teacher, one can gloss over for the moment. But I think the opportunity to take that into people's houses and enjoy part of that dialogue of being physically active, that was an important function of that for physical and mental well-being.
Thanks, Simon. And Amanda, have you got anything to? I'm conscious we've got some phenomenal questions coming in on the chat. So have you got anything you quickly wanted to add to what Simon's had to say?
No, other than it's obviously positive because we're looking at longer run strategies now. So I think if it does nothing else, it indicates that the government are thinking about longer term strategies, not just over a 4-year term. And I think focusing on adults and children and the role that physical exercise can play in that whole obesity thing can only be applauded, really.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing I really took from the conversation we've had so far is we've got an audience of parents, of teachers, of school leaders, and of children actually who are open to that clear communication that Simon was talking about. People are keen to make sure that they can stay healthy, and free of the illness. Well, here's a way to do that, and I think all of us involved in this conversation are obviously really keen advocates about it. Right, I'm going to whiz through some of these fantastic questions that have come through. So firstly, Penny Woods, and I do believe I might know you, Penny, if it's the same Penny Woods, so hi if it is, and well, hello if it isn't. I don't know if you can see the questions, Amanda, but Penny's question is, have you got any more detail on the factors and reasons sitting behind the stat of why 75% of schools believe there'll be less provision of after-school clubs and activities in the short term, and what the solutions might be to that?
I think the intent is there. I just think it's not knowing at the moment what the guidance is or could be, and it's being in the absence of knowing what the guidance is, you just have to err on the side of caution. You know, so at the moment, the people are talking about being in classroom bubbles to minimise any potential outbreaks. So to then talk about end of school when everyone can get together in a room, you know, it's just something that I think is out with people's sort of imagination at the moment. So I don't think there's the intent certainly there. That people want to bring it back as soon as possible, but it's just knowing how they can physically deliver that. And I think, yeah, I'm hearing from sort of people who are looking for childcare come September and things like that as well. And the same things apply. It's how do you gather people together at the end of the day in one space?
Yeah, and to add to that, conversations I've had recently with a couple of school leaders have been probably focused on two key things. One is a lack of ability to have foresight around what guidance is going to come down the line.
Yeah.
So guidance is coming in quite an ad hoc way for providers of support, so they're not sure what to anticipate and how to respond. The other is there is a fuzzy area between some areas of advice around what can happen at the moment within community provision and within the school, and the bubbles is a great example of that. And that it's that fuzziness which, in my conversations with school leaders, led them to say, to be honest, we just don't know how we're going to be able to respond in September. But there is an overriding feeling from the heads that we're working with that wellbeing is going to be the key ask and the key need for young people. And those head teachers that we work with at Youth Sport Trust are ones who really do know the power of physical activity and sport for physical, mental and social wellbeing. So we're anticipating the potential for growth in that area over the next few months. So solutions that might help us to change that, probably getting more young people back in school come September, and there will be an absolute element of experiential learning, I think, there from providers. We know schools have an intent to use physical activity, sport, PE. We don't know clearly how much they intend to engage with third parties in that, and I think that will be what will gradually increase through the academic year, depending on the state of the nation, I guess. That probably links, Marjan, to your question around some facilities not yet open, and what kind of options can be provided to children. Amanda, you referenced again, and I think this links with what Deanna Middleton's referred to below as well, around a growth of active transport, a growth of recognition of the advantage of creating, cultivating activity, building into the school day, both within the pedagogy of the lessons, but also movement around the school.
Absolutely. So we've seen, so the Sport England data shows us, and as Simon mentioned, that the things that have increased, there's only two things that have increased during lockdown, and it's not a surprise, but are walking and biking, you know, and you would hope that as a result of that, you know, children are thinking much more about how they're going to get to school, and parents might be considering that as well. Yeah, I think within school at the moment, it's still going to be quite tricky to move around the school, you know, and I think, again, it's back to how you can deliver that and what the advice is going to look like in September. But certainly, I think there'll be a greater thinking about how we can increase the amount of activity within lessons, how you can have more active lessons, because we know that we're going to need to support some children, you know, who've been through quite traumatic circumstances. You know, you might have to break up the lesson a little bit more. You might have to introduce, you know, much more sort of breakout areas and much more activity to try and support the learning, rather than, you know, children have been sat in front of a screen for 6 months. You know, it's quite dull. They're going to want to move about. They're going to want to be physical, and we're going to have to introduce that element of the social aspect of just activity. within the realms of this huge guidance around, but as long as you don't sit within a metre of each other, and as long as you eat your dinner separately from each other. So yeah, I think it's a challenge for schools about how to do it, but in the longer run, I think the parents will be in support of much more how active lessons are and how people get to and from school during the day.
And thanks, Amanda. And Harpreet, you've just added a comment. We totally agree, and at Youth Sport Trust we've been advocating a my personal best model of physical education for a number of years now, which is using the medium of physical education to help young people build a wider skill set within school. Absolutely, PE shouldn't be about sports skills. What PE should be about is building a confidence, a motivation, and a sustained interest in being physically active, and a recognition of what value it brings, both directly through raising your heart rate, etc., but also indirectly in terms of designing physical education and actually designing school sport to be specifically to help learning about teamwork or communication skills or integrity or fairness, and a whole range of different areas of learning which sport is not uniquely positioned, but is really powerfully positioned to educate young people in a different way. Simon, there's a cracking question come in from Laura Maria about diversity within boards, and Dame Louise Martin a resignation from the Commonwealth Games Board to make space for a more diverse board. Over to you. What do you reckon about rowing?
Well, thank you, Laura Maria. It's a very good question, as I noted. I'm encouraged by Dame Louise Martin's resignation, not because I think that this is any sort of cause célèbre or anything like that, or because I think the Commonwealth Games Federation is a particularly egregious example of an organisation as a whole which is lacking in diversity. I would have had the opportunity to listen to and engage with David Grevenberg, the chair, on a number of occasions, and I found him to be a very good advocate of diversity, particularly on behalf of the athletes. Now, if you look at the picture of the executive board for 2022, then it is not a diverse picture in terms of BAME, and that is clearly what Dame Louise Martin has found reason to resign over. I do, increasingly in the realm of diversity, look to this opportunity that sometimes you cannot change organisations and structures from within. Clearly, Martin has sat in that environment and felt that she wasn't able to change in the short term those circumstances. The CGF has moved to replace her with a Barbadian lawyer by the name of Sandra Osborne, who has is going to take up the place, and that does increase the diversity of that board. But really, and again, this I'm sure David would in himself be reflecting on this. This doesn't shouldn't come to this point, and I think that many more organisations need to have a look at themselves for this virtue. I've been involved with a couple of organisations as myself, looking at how diversity and equality can be enhanced through really quite mechanical and structural things. Some use of quotas, but really about educating people who make the decisions, who act as the gatekeepers to diversity and sort of a membership in that regard, so that you don't end up with boards looking like people who are already on the boards. And I say this as a white male, but middle income, an opportunity. But this is something that I think we can all be more aware of, all more reflective of, and it's not good enough to be in a room and look around and find other people who look like you. There are many different looks, of course, and I don't mean to underplay that, but the importance of diversity, and this is not because it's a tub thumping exercise. It's because it's good for the outcomes we want to achieve. So having a variety of sort of stakeholders and voices in the room makes for better outcomes, because we have the opportunity to engage with different groups that we wouldn't have otherwise. So yeah, I mean, it in the current circumstances, COVID has brought a lens to discussions which in some senses hasn't helped previously, or hasn't been there previously. But in some senses, the emergency sort of criteria has meant that, other things have been put to the side. And one of the things that really cannot be allowed to preserve, even with the best of intentions due to an emergency measure, is diversity and inclusion.
Thanks, Simon. And I'm not sure we're going to have time to discuss it in more detail. I was fascinated in your slides about the specific reference to the emergence of specific role models through this period. And in the sports sector there's a trope, isn't there, that if you're an elite athlete, you are a role model. Therefore, but a role model for what, and what is the purpose? And I think one of the stark things in this period has been, the reason why Marcus Rashford in part has become so prominent is because he stood for something. The reason Raheem Sterling is prominent is because he has stood for something, and he's become not a role model for an elite athlete, he's become a role model for a cause. And I think that's been a real interesting, evolution in more recent times, and what's going on. It kind of shone out to me in some of what you presented before.
Well, I think it speaks to the importance of athlete advocacy and the role that athletes can play, and role models, and the way that they're communicating with audiences who previously might not have listened to an athlete of any description.
And that's something you and I have spoken about, isn't it, in terms of those athletes that are within the talent pathway in this country? How do we help them in the soft power sense? How do we help them become advocates for whatever that cause might be that's personal to them or is important for the nation if they are representing us? Yeah.
Absolutely.
There was a couple more questions I'm going to try and sneak in before Lucy tells me off for overrunning. Howard, you asked a question of any data and insight on the impact on early years settings like children's centres. Amanda, have we got any data on that? I know what we've experienced through our Healthy Movers programme, but I wouldn't want to put that forward necessarily.
No, I mean, we haven't got anything specifically on the effect of COVID. So, and I think difficulty of getting data during this period is we're sort of reliant on, who's collecting the data and where's it from. So I haven't got anything specifically on that. I can only imagine that it would be similar kinds of things that people were concerned about, but probably magnified for smaller children.
Yeah, and what we do know is the learning gap in those early years, preschool years, is really significant. So on the basis of inequality. So if inequalities have been accentuated in this period, then there will logically, Howard, I guess, there will be an accentuated difference and a lag time in that, which is something to be mindful of. But that's very much looking at two sets of data and marrying them together to make an assumption. Lynn Humphreys, I'm going to have to make you, I think, the last question. No more have popped up more recently. You asked about online delivery of extracurricular sport and targeted referral programs via P department, and if that's been explored elsewhere. It's a good job I've been at eSport Trust a while. So a piece of work which actually was born out of a previous government obesity strategy was Change for Life. And Change for Life, particularly Change for Life primary schools, which was more, I want to say 2011-ish, 2010, 2011, and Change for Life secondary, which I think was more kind of 2008-9, they were specifically targeted in terms of investment into schools which had data on their student population which reflected inequality, but then targeted within the school population at those young people who were overweight and or obese. So there has been some information on that, some implementation of that previously, and I would imagine it's quite searchable. But if it's not, then YST email addresses are certainly searchable, and you can get in contact with us and we'll try to help if there is anything we can do. Okay, Simon and Amanda, do you have anything else that's popped into your heads as we've been talking that you wanted to share before I ask Lucy if it's time to be quiet?
Amanda?
I would say that, you know, that there's a lot of doom and gloom, but I think there's a lot of opportunities to think about a new normal and not going back to the old way of doing things. So I think, you know, there's children who are now engaged in sport in a way they haven't been before. The government are now pushing, you know, sport and physical activity as being good, not only for physical fitness, but for mental health. So I think the opportunities are there if we grab them and if we give the right support.
Fantastic. Simon?
Yeah, I'll just echo Amanda though. I think the opportunities here are great as we, you know, emerge to varying degrees and with no doubt a couple of missteps from lockdown. I think the opportunity to see, you know, those forces of realignment and recalibration of sports role in society as a whole, and the opportunities for physical engagement, which may look rather different than have been in the past, I think are really there. And I think within that, the opportunity to assess and think about, you know, the communication and the opportunity for collective endeavour through sport, whether that's mitigated or mediated, forgive me, through you know, technology, I think it'd be a really interesting opportunity. So no, I think we should be really mindful of how we move forward on this, not least because the benefits of which will be felt not just in well-being and potentially, you know, in a playground or on a sports field at some point, but in the absence of being in a hospital. So I'm all for it.